I want to set up a couple of ideas spinning round, and then I want us to have a little think about it. So what I'm going to do is that my first idea is about the common good, and the second idea is about abundance and Jesus' response to the challenge of immediate need in the story that we've just heard. Once I've set those ideas spinning, I then would quite like everybody to engage in a little bit of dialogue, and then I'm going to ask you to commit to just one act of generosity. So that's the plan. See what happens, eh? As we begin, I just want to start with this premise, and by all means disagree with me, but just hold on to it if you don't mind. So work on the premise that Jesus' life, death, and resurrection begun the bringing in of God's kingdom of justice and mercy, and that we are experiencing here and now the now but not yet of that. We are journeying together towards renewal and absolute justice. So that's the premise on which I'm going to start. And as such, we as God's people should be seeking the vision for this kingdom in the cracks of the universe, those that look like righteousness, and we need to be discerning Christ's path being the way, the truth, and the life. That path will bring in God's kingdom, and we must play our part in making kingdom connections and changing the world for the better, making what Bishop Paul calls the bigger difference. There you go. I got the strap line in, so I will go behind here. So ours is the work of salvation and renewal in Christ's name. And that needs to be extended to all corners of human existence. And this has to include all things, even the rich, even the poor. So that's where I want to start, with inclusion, with the common good. Because if all things are in the process of renewal, that has to include all things. We can't exclude anyone, which makes perhaps my liberal elite agenda slightly more complex and painful in a process of renewal. Because our Christian response to poverty has to be that of justice and mercy that's extended to all, even the rich, even the poor. We have to allow ourselves to be renewed and redeemed, because seeking the common good means taking up the complex step into the unknown territory of the other. So I've been working with an organisation that's called Together for the Common Good. Has anybody heard of Together for the Common Good? Well, I've been working with them for a few years, and we've been working on a particular project in Walton that's now started to extend a little bit more across the city. It was begun by a woman called Jenny Sinclair, which she's the daughter of David Shepherd, who was the Bishop of Liverpool. And she sees it very much as not a philosophy, but a practice. And I'm going to explain a little bit about the common good, and perhaps it will resonate for you, because it's one of those exciting philosophies, actions, practicalities that actually is very much common sense. It feels normal, but actually it's very good to be able to engage in a practice. So Jenny writes, we all think we know what the common good means. The classic definition is the common good is a set of conditions in which every individual in the community can flourish. Does that make that sort of like resonates for you in terms of what you perhaps perceive the common good to be? But the common good is not a utopian ideal to be imposed by one enlightened group upon the other. Rather, it is something that we create. It is how that set of conditions is created that is the crucial question. The conditions need to be built by us, working together across our differences. It requires unlikely partnerships. It is something we create in common across our different interests. So suddenly the common good becomes slightly more complex than the ground in which we flourish. So if we talk about the practice of common good, building the common good requires people who may seriously disagree to come together and to have difficult conversations. Those whose interests and circumstances are different. It requires us to listen to each other, to tell each other the truth, encounter each other in relationship. It requires a balance of interests. It means forming positive relationships and proactively collaborating with people who are different or with whom we disagree. The common good is difficult stuff. It means that we're walking into territory that sees our thinking challenged by the thinking of those who believe that there are deserving and undeserving poor. It has us walking into the territory of the Brexit voter, the person who is threatened by the sudden influx of needy asylum seekers and refugees. This common good practice has us standing and conversing alongside those who will object to Hope Plus Food Bank because we're helping foreigners and not our own. It means we have to listen to Rees-Mogg and listen and listen and listen. Even when we are not heard, we have to listen, because common good thinking, listening and looking will lead us into relationships even with our enemies. Practicing the common good should rehumanize systems that have lost their soul, because it involves us putting human dignity at the heart of economic, civic and cultural life. This is where I sigh, because the common good is really difficult, and I really often don't like it. It makes me feel dirty and uncomfortable. It takes me too close to cruel people. It sometimes feels incredibly reactionary, and it's exhausting. It really, really tires me out. It means that I have to spend time with reactionary, racists, homophobes, sexist, entitled people. And actually all I want to do is spend time in my safe little nice ghetto. I want to hang out with people that like me, people who like my posts on Facebook, and people who wear nice comfy shoes. But I'm thinking about how Jesus was spending time with people who weren't necessarily like him. The Pharisee, who was threatened, so threatened that he refused to offer respect, not having washed his feet, and waited for a woman to wash Jesus' feet with her tears. I'm thinking about Jesus, who asked Zacchaeus, the tax collector, to share his tea with him, to go to his house even. I'm also thinking about Jesus, who shared his last meal with Judas. Jesus enters into the complex space of rehumanizing those who dehumanize him. That's what common good thinking and practice is about. I would encourage you to have a look at Together for the Common Good website and have a think and have a look at the complexity of common good, because there are 5 basic principles. One is around human dignity. One is around human relationships and around reconciliation, subsidiarity and solidarity. So subsidiarity is this organising at the most basic level of need. So not thinking about the big things, thinking about the real needs. And solidarity and subsidiarity need to sit together. We need to be looking for our comrades, but also looking for those who are other. It's about participation and association. It's about coming together, but it's also about looking out to other associations. Common good thinking also encourages us to look at how the earth matters, how we live as human beings on our earth. It's all about rehumanising those who have been dehumanised. Common good thinking emphasises that for everyone to be included, nobody needs to be left behind. There needs to continue to be a preferential option for the poor, vulnerable and marginalised. And for the healthy society, the principle must be centred on the decision-making processes. Common good thinking gets us to the heart of decision-making processes. So the challenge for us then is to engage with those who do not share our concern for the poor, for those who do not want to see an end to food banks, who indeed find them uplifting. How do we get these people to speak to us? How do we become included in their conversations? How do we make change happen in those people? How do we convert them? How do we put these common good practices and principles into practice? And how do we get a seat at the table? How does our good news get heard above fake news of Brexit and Trumpism? Now, I don't have all the answers to that question, and I guess what we need to do is to seek in our hearts how we are going to get a seat at that table with the difficult people, to have the difficult conversations. One of the things that I'm trying to do in my role is to get a seat at that table. I'm trying, as the Director of Social Justice, to find ways to infiltrate and engage the other by stealth, asking people to participate in the process of seeking the common good. I just realised that now this is being recorded, quite frankly, the others might notice that by stealth I am getting a seat at the table that, anyway, hey ho. So part one is done, common good, thinking, embedded, just the beginning of some thinking around the common good perhaps. Part two now. So having established both the direction of travel towards God's kingdom, wrestled a little with the implications of seeking the common good, and I just briefly want to look at the passage from Matthew that we've just heard, which I've actually closed. What was it? It was Matthew 14, wasn't it? This is a great Bible, by the way. It's just the same as every other Bible, but some of the bits there are things underlined that. So interestingly enough, this bit, the feeding of the 5,000, doesn't act in terms of their way of interpreting justice. It isn't a justice action, and I guess probably what I'm going to say now challenges that a little bit. So it underlines when Jesus is doing justice, and then it sort of has some nice sort of. Anyway, yeah, it's a useful Bible, but it is just a Bible. There we go. So having established all of that, I'm going to place all of this in the context of this passage. At the beginning of this passage, you'll have realised that something else was happening beforehand. We read that Herod had arrested John the Baptist and had senselessly murdered him. John the Baptist being Jesus' pathfinder, his messenger, his cousin and his friend. And John the Baptist had been decapitated for the sake of a party favour. It's a truly disgusting story, really. And this passage that Helen read for us is offered within the cloud of mourning that Jesus is under. The story begins with the sad words, "After Jesus heard about John, he crossed Lake Galilee to go to some place where he could be alone. But the crowds found out and followed him on foot from the towns." Sad, really sad. Jesus just wanted to be on his own, to mourn for his friend, and then all of this stuff comes towards him. In this context, we are told that Jesus felt sorry for them and healed everyone who was sick. I can't imagine the compassion that Jesus has in that moment. There he is mourning for his, the person who brought his mission in, who paved the way, his death so senselessly. And Jesus felt sorry for the people and has compassion on them. Grief and thwarted attempt at lone times, Jesus has compassion and Jesus heals. And there begins the story that we've heard today, a story of bad preparation, emptiness, desert place, of not enough that is broken, blessed and given in abundance. A story where counting matters and injustice is noted, where there wasn't enough, but there's plenty left over. It is an impossible story, but it is a story that we retell every week in and out at Hope Plus. It's a story of the food bank that happens from here and of the volunteer programme that happens at the cathedral, and many, many other acts of generosity where there doesn't seem like enough, but by some miracle there is. It's a story of risk and a story of despair being opened out into opportunity and hope. So those people that Jesus felt sorry for, these were the people who had needs. So many needs that they gathered and waited. They risked their time and they stayed even though they had nothing. And for whatever reason, they came to Jesus to have their needs met. They wanted healing. They wanted to be near Jesus. And there were a lot of them. Indeed, the writer notes that there were 500 men, and he notes his own prejudice that he doesn't count the women and the children. So given the general demographic of the numbers of women in relation to men who go to church, we can assume that that's a third more. So that's about 15,000 women. And let's assume that those women had 2 children because they all had to be together. So perhaps 10,000 children. So 30,000 people. Suddenly, the problems associated with lack of accurate counting becomes apparent. However many the people were there, and perhaps it is an exaggeration, but nevertheless the writer wants me to understand there were a lot of people. So the disciples' observation that place had become a space for healing is also interesting because it's become a desert with no facilities, with no food, with nothing. So it's not unreasonable that the exaggeration, if it is indeed an exaggeration, is there. So sending the crowd home seems like a sensible move. It seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And Jesus' command to feed them is absurd, particularly in the light of the rations that are available. We're told that 5 loaves and 2 fish for a lot of people. And the reality is that each week at Hope Plus, we face the same problems, don't we? There's not enough. Every week, thousands of people across our country face the same problem. There is not enough. What do we do? What do we do in the face of this? Do we just give up? Do we face reality? Do we send them away? The truth is that those people were the responsibility of the disciples. They were the presenting problem in that moment. And Jesus expects his disciples to take responsibility for the situation. And they do. Maybe a little reluctantly, but nevertheless they do. They create a system, they get people sat down and give Jesus the meagre rations. We're told that Jesus breaks the bread, he gives thanks, and then he asks his disciples to distribute it. We only have what we have. We can't offer any more than we have. Some of us might be able to offer more than others, but most of us don't have an awful lot of extra supplies. We can only operate from our assets. There's no point in worrying about what we don't have, because that doesn't exist. This is the place to start. This is the point from which we begin to become generous people. We have to give that up. We cannot withhold. So once the asset is identified, the story teaches us to offer it freely, to offer it sacramentally, to give thanks, ask for blessing on it and get on with it, share it, and share it liberally. In Jesus' story, we're told that everyone, all 30,000 or however many there were fed, and that there was a lot left over. Again, a little bit of counting, 12 large baskets. It seems that they were more accurate with that than they were with counting people. This story is a story of asset, of sacrifice, thanksgiving, and abundance. It is an impossible story. But then aren't so many of our stories impossible? So my observation is that the solution to need is both utterly straightforward and totally complicated. The problem of solving injustice, of national and international poverty, is massive. As individuals, we can do nothing that will have significant impact. Bad news. Yet, we can attend to the immediate concerns that present themselves to us in the here and now. Jesus was dealing with systematic issues of massive political and religious injustices that the people faced. His very existence threatened the occupied forces. The Gospels are full of stories of him railing against authorities, against the lawyers, against those who lied to the people. But this did not blind Jesus to the needs of the people in the moment. Those people needed feeding there and then, and it was the responsibility of him and the disciples to provide, part of the complex needs of those people as they were presented to him at that moment. And the complexity of the task that we face is that we have to face and respond to human need without exception. We don't get to choose who we help and who we don't help. We are called also to challenge injustices. We are required to care for the earth, to proclaim God's kingdom, and to teach, baptise and nurture the faith. Because this is the mission of the church. This is the mission of God's people, each of us. But we don't need to work from any other place other than our assets, from what we have. This is all we can do. All we can do is offer up what we have, however meagre, and expect it to be broken and blessed by Jesus, and then to start handing it out, tiny morsel by tiny morsel. So, two ideas spinning around. Firstly, the common good, and then secondly, around this asset, abundance, and Jesus' response to the immediate need. Something in this must have sparked something off on you, so I just want to give you a few seconds really to have a moment to converse. Either you're in agreement, there's argument, there's irritation, confusion, excitement, I don't know, whatever it is. Suddenly you're feeling empowered, maybe you're feeling disempowered. But just for a moment, could you just jangle with the person next to you and just pull out just a couple of thoughts with each other while I just gather myself for the last second of act of generosity. Okay. So, yeah. No, I'm going to force you to your. If you got. What do you do at school? You do this, don't you? Oh yeah, you're all right. You're sorted now. So now I'm going to ask you to focus on your act of generosity. I'm going to read the passage again for you, and I want you to picture what you have to offer. It might be food, it might be time, it might be expertise, prayers, money, whatever it is. However small, however tiny, what even that little morsel, what? I always get confused between the fish and the loaves. How many loaves were there? 2 loaves, 5 fishes. 5 loaves, 2 fishes. Well, we'll find out in a minute. I'm going to read it. Whatever it is, I want you to offer it up. And as the writer describes Jesus breaking and blessing, I want you to imagine that offering, whatever it is that you've offered, being held by Jesus and offered up for sharing and distribution. I want you to try and picture and believe that it will make a difference, that your generous act will change the world. That by that small offering, thousands of people will be nourished and there will be an abundance. Oh, I'm really sorry, I've got a bit of a cold, so I'm going to read with a sweet in my mouth, which isn't great, is it? Here we go. So take a moment to picture that you want to offer, and as we read it, in the context of our lives and in the complex life of Jesus in that moment, we'll offer that up. After Jesus heard about John, he crossed Lake Galilee to go to some place where he could be alone. But the crowds found out and they followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus got out of the boat, he saw the large crowd. He felt sorry for them and healed everyone who was sick. That evening, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "This place is like a desert, and it is already late. Let the crowds leave so that they can go to the villages and buy some food." And Jesus replied, "They don't have to leave. Why don't you give them something to eat?" But the disciples said, "We have only 5 small loaves of bread and 2 fish." Jesus said to his disciples, "Go and bring the food." And he told the crowd to sit down on the grass. Jesus took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. He looked up towards heaven and blessed the food. Then he broke the bread and handed it to his disciples, and they gave it to the people. After everyone had eaten all that they wanted, Jesus' disciples picked up 12 large baskets of leftovers. There were about 5,000 men who ate, not counting the women and children. Our small acts of kindness, our chipping away at injustice, will, in the name of Christ, change the world. We will see God's kingdom come. Amen.